So first, we have John Silva, and he'll speak first. He's the Senior Director of Education and Training at the News Literacy Project. He joined the NLP in March of 2017 after he'd spent about 13 years teaching middle and high school social studies. And he first became involved with news literacy and the issues involved there in 2014 when his students engaged in the original classroom program that NLP designed to teach students about these issues. So welcome, John. And Kyle Pope is the editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And before joining CJR, he worked as an editor at Condé Nast, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Observer. So with that, take it away, John.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and Rhoda for inviting me to participate. I would just want to start by trying to illustrate the challenges of the what we call the misinformation landscape, to sort of help us understand some of the complexities of the issue, and a little bit about some things for us to think about how we might be able to navigate these very difficult times that we're dealing with. So one of the first things I always like to emphasize right off the top is that we have to stop using the term fake news. Once upon a time, fake news had a real meaning, but especially since 2016, it has become a weaponized term that is mainly used as a sort of dismissive, derisive term to say, I don't like this, I don't agree with this. Or also commonly, people do sometimes use it ironically. But the reality is that misinformation is very complex. There's a lot of different types of misinformation out there. I'm going to show you some examples. And one of the things we have to remember is that one of the reasons why we feel so overwhelmed, why we sometimes feel confused, why we feel cynicism creeping in when we're looking at news and information is because of misinformation. Misinformation is confusing the situation. It's making it overwhelming for us. And so we each have to try to get a handle on it so that we can tamp down on that cynicism a little bit. So there's a couple different types I want to emphasize, and these are the most common types of misinformation you will see, especially on social media. So this photo was tweeted by Eric Trump recently, and then amplified by many other people, trying to suggest that Ice Cube and 50 Cent were wearing these Trump hats when in fact the hats had been photoshopped. So when you have a real image, but a piece of it has been manipulated, we call that manipulated content. So in this case, it's a real image, but one little piece of it was changed to create false information. Another one is what we call false context. So this image out of Miami last week went massively viral, claiming that former Vice President Joe Biden took a knee during the national anthem. And it fed into some, pretty strongly held social and political beliefs. But the thing is that if you just take a look at it for a second, you realize that there's evidence that that's not during the national anthem, right? Dr. Biden doesn't have her hand over her height. The dancers in back are posing. This was actually, he was posing for a photo with these dancers who had performed at a rally. So false context, we change the caption, we change the meaning, we create new misinformation. We have what's called fabricated content. This rumor has been going viral recently. It's a completely made up rumor. There's no evidence to suggest that it's true, but the idea is that when something is completely made up, we call it fabricated. And then the last one, this is a fake tweet that was created to discredit President Trump in the aftermath of the scene of Rudy Giuliani in the recent Borat film. So the thing is, we call this imposter content, where somebody has created something that's false and they're trying to make it look like it's from someone famous as if it's authentic. So there's a lot of apps and things out there where you can create these fake tweets. They look real, right? It has the right profile photo, it has the blue check mark, it looks authentic, but it's not. And so we call this imposter content. So understanding how these different types of misinformation are created helps us also a little bit understand about why this is happening. What are the motivations? So there's several different motivations in general that we see for why people create misinformation. We see it with scams and things where people are simply trying to make money. Some people are doing it just because they want to see what kind of reaction they get. But perhaps more dangerously and more in a more complex way, we're seeing it used as a political tool by elected officials, government officials, campaigns, and the like, politicians, but also like partisan groups. They're using misinformation to try to gain an advantage politically. And in the most extreme cases, we have active mis and disinformation campaigns from outside sources that are actually trying to undermine our trust in our democratic processes. We see this as a rampant problem right now again. So where do some of these people come from? So the thing is when we look at some of the motivations and intent, often we focus on the people who create it, but there's also the people who share it, right? So people who are doing it for their self-interest are, you know, the scams, clickbait farming, people are using misinformation to generate revenue, right? In the political realm, we see the group interest, right? We're trying to gain a partisan political advantage or to further a social cause. But sometimes people are sharing misinformation genuinely out of a sense of altruism. I have a great example I'll show you in a second to illustrate that sometimes ordinary people are sharing something because they actually think it's real and it should be shared. And then we have the malicious actors, the people on the extreme ends of the political spectrum, but we also see it with people who are spreading conspiracy theories. So I'm going to show you a couple examples to highlight this. This is a scam that the FTC recently warned people about. People are getting these random text messages that are saying that they have a package waiting for them. And if you click on the link, it's going to take you to a website. And basically it's a phishing scam where they're using this false information to try to get you to give over your personal information. Group interest, that fake Biden post about taxing your 401k, right? This was created because of trying to be a partisan political advantage. In the early days of the stay-at-home orders, there was a lot of misinformation, and there's still a lot of misinformation about masks and mask wearing. But this one in particular went viral because people genuinely thought they were sharing, you know, a credible tip, right? The idea that if you just microwave your face mask, you can sanitize it. The problem is that that's actually a really bad idea. So many people were sharing it and so many people were trying it that actually fire departments around the country had to put out notices that say, hey, please don't microwave your masks, because people were actually setting their microwaves and their kitchens on fire as a result. But you can imagine why someone would feel sort of like as if they're sharing something useful, but not bothering to check it. And then this is an example of a malicious rumor, right? People are trying to really capitalize on the strong feelings around the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa, and trying to discredit these social causes by making up these false rumors, in this case that McDonald's is going to take down American flags. So the last big point I want to make is that we have to recognize in all of this that misinformation is all about manipulating us into believing something is true. And one of the ways that it does that is by manipulating our emotions. So coming back to this example of a former Vice President Joe Biden taking a knee during the national anthem, right? You can imagine the range of emotional responses people would have to this. You can actually see it in the lower left of the Facebook post. Some people had to use a little angry emoji. Some people put thumbs up. Some people had this sort of like surprised, right? So there's a range of emotions that are happening. But what's happening is that in that emotional response, because that's what misinformation is doing, it's eliciting a strong emotional response and it's getting us to react. Because in that emotional moment, the rational parts of our brains are not really part of the process. We're really focusing on an emotional response. And so what misinformation is trying to do is use that emotion to get us to react, especially on social media, to like it, to share it, to retweet, to comment quickly without even really thinking about it. And in the work we do at the News Literacy Project in particular, we do emphasize that adolescents are particularly vulnerable to this, as are older Americans. And it has to do with adolescence because of brain development. The last parts of the brain to develop, the prefrontal cortex, the parts that deal with executive functions and things like controlling impulses, right? The emotional impulse. Those parts of your brain are not fully developed until the early to mid 20s. So adolescents are really only responding from emotion. When we're talking about older adults, though, there's two things that are going on that make older adults also, especially those over 65. Because the reverse in some cases is true, that these are some of the first areas that start to decline. But more importantly for older adults, when the older you are, the more set you are in some of your beliefs around social and political issues, to the point where those beliefs, the causes you support, the way that you vote and all those things, they have become part of your identity, and you actually have an emotional attachment to those beliefs. And so when you see misinformation that hits those emotional beliefs, you're going to react in a very strong way, because it's something that's very closely tied to what you already believe and what you think. And so we have to be aware of this when we're talking about misinformation, that when we get deceived, like if we accidentally share something that turns out to be not true, we kind of have to acknowledge that we were manipulated. But it's also part of what makes it difficult for people to admit when they make a mistake, because we don't want to feel foolish. But we can maybe take a step back and acknowledge that, you know what, that's what's going on. They're trying to manipulate us. And any emotion can be used against us, right? We see anger and fear in a lot of ways. That text message about the package waiting scam, right? That's a curiosity. Your curiosity is piqued. I wonder what's going on. I wonder what the package is. Sometimes people fall for satire. They'll see an article from like The Onion or the Babylon Bee, and they'll laugh at it, and they won't in that first moment realize that it's satire. And some people share satire without even realizing it. So we also have to recognize that any emotion can be used against us. So that's going to take me to that's the end of sort of my piece here. And so I will sort of hand it back over to Jane, and we can then, I guess, bring in Kyle.
Yeah, and I'm actually just going to hand it right over to Kyle. So Kyle, if you want to go ahead and make your remarks, and then I'll come back and we can start the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, John. That was super interesting. When you were talking about why younger people are particularly susceptible, reminded me of my teenage daughter who got caught up in one of these phishing scams. And even though she hears me all day, every day talking about misinformation in media, and I was like, well, how could you do that? How could you? But she did. So, and also your comments just about how these things tap into deep emotions among news consumers is so important, and it's partly what I want to talk about. So John's, I thought, provided a terrific overview on the roots of misinformation, how it's responded to by people, and in fact, there's been a lot of attention broadly focused on bad actors who spread falsehoods, manipulate legitimate news. We focused a lot on the social media networks, who I think, frankly, have largely sidestepped their responsibilities in a lot of these cases. CJR, which is the Columbia Journalism Review, which I run, has been working with partners at Columbia University to track what are called pink slime sites, which are fake sites posing as legitimate local news sites that are peddling misinformation. These seek to sort of tap into the trust that a lot of people inherently have in local news, and use that trust to turn it against itself. So that's all sort of classic misinformation. What I'm going to focus on is something a little bit different, which is what is and should be the role of journalism, of mainstream legitimate news outlets in dealing with this information. Like, what is our role as journalists in reporting on it, and what traps does that set for us in terms of amplifying it, and how does that sort of come in contact with some of the most basic ideas of how journalism is supposed to work, having to do with letting both sides talk, having to do with providing balance, objectivity, fair comment, airing all views. A lot of this has been called into question, or at least has been put under a new microscope because of where we are, and again, it's raised questions about how journalism should be practiced. The best example, and the one that tends to be cited most in this area, is Donald Trump's Twitter feed. So here you have a platform that is used actively by the President of the United States to often promote falsehoods. So the question that started his administration, but has continued now throughout this whole thing, is how should journalists report on false information coming from the official Twitter account of the president? I have been arguing for some time that just because the president says it on his Twitter feed doesn't mean that it's necessarily news, especially if he keeps saying the same thing over and over and over again. And that we have a responsibility to point out falsehoods if they arise, even coming from the president. But again, this is a very, very difficult question for a lot of journalists to grapple with. He is the president, arguably the most powerful leader on earth. If he says it, it's news, but how do you deal with it? And so if you think about those issues that are raised by Trump's Twitter and then expand that exponentially, that's sort of where we are. That in terms of this question of how does mainstream journalism deal with this? We, last week, published a piece that I thought was a really interesting way to look at this. It looked at misinformation around mail-in vote. So there is a big, and you've heard it partly from the president, but from a lot of people, trying to sow doubt about mail-in voting, whether your vote will be counted, whether it's more subject to fraud than in-person voting, whether your vote is going to count. Most of that reporting has been disputed by facts. So we recently published a piece by some researchers from Harvard that they looked at 55,000 news stories, 5 million tweets, 75,000 posts on public Facebook pages that referred to mail-in voting fraud. And they looked at sort of what the genesis of a lot of that information was. What they found is that most Americans were alerted to questions about online voting, not by the original false posts, which were seen by a relatively small number of people, but by mainstream news outlets, many of them on the left, which thought that they were rebutting the claims of the original pieces. But in fact, what happened is that in many cases, they exposed people to the claims in the first place. So again, everybody's intentions were good, I think, in this case. Everybody meant to sort of like address these falsehoods as they were coming out, but the effect oftentimes didn't work. So again, I think, and this I hope will be a subject of our conversation, part of our conversation this evening, is I think this points to the need for a new way of journalism, a new way of thinking about journalism, regardless of what happens on Tuesday, because all of this was sort of in train before that, and I think will continue regardless of what happens. I think media outlets have continued to view the notion that calling out information as untrue is a partisan act. There still seems to be this belief if a Republican says something and I say that is a lie, let's even put aside the question of lie, which is definitely a loaded word. Let's just say what he just said is untrue. There is a discomfort in a lot of areas of among a lot of journalists that is a political act. I don't think it is. I don't think it's, and I think we should be nonpartisan about calling out falsehoods. But I think that there is definitely that view. And I think that even if you think about how stories are framed, I mean, there has been a lot of progress in this area. If you read now stories, especially in the bigger national outlets, you'll see very high up people saying somebody said this, which isn't supported by facts, but they said it anyway. And so the context is put right with the original claim, which is new. For a long time over the last few years, people have been running with a falsehood, and it takes much further down in the story for them to say that actually that doesn't appear to be factual. But now people are being more aggressive about it. That's not as true on television, I have to say. People are allowed to sort of say, make their claim as much as they want for as long as they want before it's corrected. And you even saw this come up during the debates. Like, at what point is it fair for the moderator to step in and say, well, that's not true? Or is the correct journalistic response to let viewers and readers decide for themselves, and to let people say it, and people can judge for themselves based on what they hear at the end. All of this has taken on a lot more weight over the last 6 months with coronavirus misinformation, which is on a different level and on a different scale than political misinformation, because it involves health information that could affect people's lives. So it's one thing for you to say, you wearing a mask doesn't work, when you know that actually the science says that it's important, and that more people will live if people wear masks. So again, this is a sort of quandary for journalism, but I think that there, essentially, I think the conventional rules of journalism haven't kept pace with the misinformation world that we live in. So the way I see this, as and we were talking before this conversation started about a conference that we had at Columbia last month, where one of the things that we were addressing is sort of what are some of the big ongoing projects that journalism as a profession needs to tackle, and this was one of them. Like, how do you stay true to your principles of fairness and balanced reporting without being manipulated by people who seek to turn those very principles against us? So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Kyle. Those were both really interesting presentations, and I feel like we could talk for hours on this. But let me just start out. I want to come back to some of the specifics that you each talked about in your presentations. But just as a kind of a general place to start. John, you talked about, some of the different types of sites and information that are aimed at misleading people. And I want to kind of focus on, the types of news sites that are intentionally, and I'm saying news to some degree and, in quotes, basically the kinds of things that Kyle, you didn't talk about, the sort of fake news sites, the pink slime sites, and even, sites like Breitbart, or I would argue a lot of the right-wing sort of news/opinion sites, and there are similar sites on the left as well that are portraying themselves as purveyors of fair and accurate information, but really are not, and I would argue put out a lot of misinformation. So one of the things I hear most often from people I know who are not journalists is how difficult it is for them to tell the difference, and how to differentiate beyond a few well-known news brands, how to tell when some of this information is coming in over social media, or their friends are emailing it to them or whatnot. So can each of you talk a little bit about how you think, news consumers who want to do a better job of this, are there some tools or techniques they can use, or resources they can turn to try and get a better handle on who's doing, a good job, may make mistakes, but are trying honestly to do a good job, versus those that are actively trying to pass along misinformation?
I think one of the simplest things that we can start doing as a first step in this process is by taking a step back and recognizing the differences between news and opinion. One of the challenges that when we look at the overwhelming amount of information that's coming across our screens, be it a mobile device, a computer, or television screen, the overwhelming majority of what we're seeing is opinion pieces. And the challenge is that, that's a lot of what people see. And because these are opinion pieces about current events, about major policy issues and such, it's easy to conflate the news and opinion pieces. So one of the things that we try to teach young people, but it's also a simple thing that we can just sort of ask ourselves when we see something, is just simply ask, like, is this trying to inform me or is this trying to persuade me? And if we start with that very simple question, right, it's usually fairly easy because, you know, opinion pieces, sometimes they're usually labeled, right? But it's also about the language, right? Opinion pieces are written in the first person. They use persuasive language and exaggeration and hyperbole, and they make, you know, big claims. Whereas a news piece is simply trying to tell us the who, the what, the where, and the when. But it's very difficult because depending on what we're seeing in our feeds, like you mentioned, like there's organizations like Breitbart and Wonkette on the left and Occupy Democrats, a number of those, all they put out is opinion and commentary. They're not even trying to follow the standards of quality journalism. So I think it's on us to try to think about, like, who are these organizations and who are these people that are putting this content out that's coming up on my feed. I think that's a good starting point.
Kyle, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this point about opinion is really right on. I mean, basically, opinion is sort of swallowed up a lot of these big news organizations. It always drives me crazy, and I always get in big fights with the cable networks who say, well, we have straight news during the day, and then we ship to opinion at night. And I'm like, well, where's the sign that tells people that you've moved from one to the other? Like, how is the viewer supposed to know that? Like, because they'll say, well, what Hannity does isn't at all what the news department does, or what Rachel Maddow does isn't at all what NBC News has done. I said, well, how do you know? How are people supposed to parse this out? Because not only do you have Maddow on, but then you have Maddow on the set talking to one of the news reporters, and it's all very fuzzy. And it's not just television. I mean, if you look at now, and I hate to pick on them, but it's just egregious. If you look at the website of the Washington Post, opinion is just swallow that website. Like, I mean, if you go on right now and look at the number of opinion pieces versus news pieces, it's way disproportionate on the opinion side. Same, a little bit, it's a little less at the Times, but it's still heavy. This has to do, I mean, I don't know how much we want to talk about this, but, you know, their business model is now about subscribers as opposed to advertisers, and those subscribers want this opinion that sort of reflects their views, so that's what they're giving them. But I do think it's directly, I do think it colors how people see media, and when people say the media seems biased, it's no surprise that they think that because of what's being served up.
Yeah, I think there's it's a distinction that people have stopped. If the people ever could make it, they've stopped being able to make it in many ways. And, you saw this there was this debate last week, on the Hunter Biden story, a real controversy at the Wall Street Journal, which is obviously one of the best, most respected papers in the country. And their news people were given, the information about, the allegations about Hunter Biden, and they chose not to run with them and wrote a very skeptical story about those allegations. And then somebody on the opinion page wrote a piece basically, taking those allegations at face value. And then there was this enormous debate, okay, if you're a Wall Street Journal reader, do you actually know the difference between those, and which one of these is actually the Wall Street Journal talking to you?
Yeah. I worked at the Wall Street Journal for 10 years, and it was funny because most of the news staff disagreed with, but most of the subscribers loved it. But to be fair to the Journal, at least in the time that I was there, I can't speak for what's happened since, and I was there, it must be said, pre-Murdoch. The dividing line was very clear. I mean, there was, they did their thing and we did our thing, and there was not much at all bleed over from one to the other. And in fact, I thought in a way, the wall was stronger than other places. But yeah, to your point, to the point of like, what does this mean for the reader? They must be quite confused. And actually, this is, and I'll just stop on this, but this is one area where I think local newspapers have done a much better job. Most local outlets, well, first off, local TV is largely devoid of opinion. I mean, it's pretty straightforward news. But also local newspapers, they really tend to be quite careful about labeling they put news analysis or opinion on stories, or keeping it on the editorial page. And I don't think that there's any mystery why people tend to trust local news more. And I think this is one of the reasons.
Yeah, yeah. And John, can you talk, I just wanted to go back a little bit to, sort of this similar question, but with the visual imagery. I mean, I think some of the examples you showed, it's very powerful, and, we all know the research that says, visual images and videos, our brains are wired to, pick that stuff up, very quickly, and it's very influential. And, you see these kinds of images manipulated like that. Are there ways for an average, news or social media consumer, when they're seeing this stuff, how can you, if you're looking at your Facebook feed or Instagram or whatever, how can you try and judge whether these things coming in are actually accurate or not, or manipulated?
So there are a couple of basic tools and skills that you can learn for verifying information. If we're talking about visuals, like memes and graphics like that, learning how to do a reverse image search is a very effective tool. So basically, it's a type of a search where the search engine is going to try to match the pixel pattern of an image with the images in the database. You can do that from a browser. There are ways that you can do it from a mobile device. But I think one of the most effective tools, though, that I think a lot of us could do very easily, because we already do this, but we just need to take another step to be a little more deliberate, is what we call lateral reading. So Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew from the Stanford Graduate School of Education, they've been doing a lot of research into what's called civic online reasoning, like whether or not you can recognize and evaluate information. And they have found that, like, a lot of young people in particular, they just can't. So what lateral reading is, it's an academic way of saying, Google it. So if you see something that you are suspicious of, when you have that emotional reaction or something just doesn't seem right, get off of that page, open up a new browser tab, close Facebook, close Twitter, whatever it is, and Google some of the details. And when you see those search results, you want to look for things like fact checks and news reports and try to verify details for yourself, right? The idea is that we can probably verify things, whether or not things are true, in about the time it would take to wash your hands. If you do a good Google search using this lateral reading. So the idea is you get off the source and you read laterally. And look for the reputable fact check organizations. I just want to say one point about that. There's a lot of opinions about some of the fact checking organizations. The most reputable ones are the ones that show their work. So they're gonna do the fact check. They're gonna tell you what they figured out, but they're also gonna show you all the evidence, all the context, all the background, so you can evaluate it for yourself. So I think just trusting your instincts that something might not be true, and just Googling the details will save you a lot of time and not go down a rabbit hole of misinformation.
Yeah. I want to follow up, on talking about that with the fact-checking sites, and, the piece that you talked about, Kyle, the idea that a lot of the misinformation people are getting doesn't come from the original site, but it's been spread then by mainstream sites, oftentimes trying to debunk the information. And I have seen other studies that talk about that. In fact, some of the fact-checking sites, or the warnings that some of the social media companies, like Facebook particularly, are putting on some stories that come from questionable sources, that in fact does have the effect of spreading the news more rather than debunking it. That these sites might not actually be having the impact that we would hope they would have. So given that, and given what you guys have just found with that study, Kyle, I think there is a real question of, are these sites actually doing what we want and helping, or are they potentially creating more harm than good by doing this? So, I don't know what the answer is, but like, what should responsible journalism, or journalists that want to debunk some of this kind of misinformation without just helping spread it, what should they be doing? What can they be doing?
Yeah, I think one of the, I actually have a lot of respect for people who do this fact checking full time. It's it's tiresome and it's hard and it takes a lot of effort. But if you look at, for example, the Washington Post has a very aggressive fact-checking operation, and they've been doing this throughout Trump's administration, and they've been very forthright about pointing out his lies, and it's had no effect, right? He's not, according to them, he's not lying less because he's being called out on it. And his, the size of the people who watch Fox News or other places where a lot of this stuff gets circulated is not going down. So, what is the effect of it? I'm not sure. I mean, I think trying to sort of run after these dogs after they're out of the cage, or whatever the metaphor is, is really difficult. I mean, I think that's why I'm really interested in us to rethink the story, and to sort of contextualize the falsehood in the story as it's being reported, as opposed to reporting the falsehood and then running after it and saying, no, that thing we told you about, that's not true. I mean, that doesn't work in real life. I mean, I can't tell my children something that's wrong and then intentionally, and then come back later and say, don't forget that thing that I told you. It doesn't work. So I think that we just need to be more thoughtful about how do we package these things. But again, it's partly it's a generational question. I mean, there are a lot of people who grew up in journalism who are like, what you do is if somebody says something, you write it down and you report it. And if people have a problem with it, they can say it in the story, but you let them have their say, and you respect the viewer and the reader to sort of be able to parse all that. I just think all this stuff is happening so fast, and it's happening across global platforms, and it's happening at the behest of very, very sophisticated players, that I don't think those rules work anymore. So again, I respect the fact-checking platforms, but I don't know that there's evidence that they've been effective.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple things at play in this that make it really complicated. One of the things that we have to keep in mind, especially given the current climate, is the relationship between belief and identity. Mm-hmm. That political beliefs have become much more intertwined with identity than we saw several years ago, right? People would, more than 4 years ago, people would say like, yes, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, maybe conservative, maybe liberal, but now it's becoming much more important to your everyday life, in the sense if you see the people who are the most the most diehard Trump supporters, right? They fly Trump flags, and so it's gone from being a Republican to being a Trump supporter. And if you look at the people who have the strongest held political beliefs on either end of the spectrum, nothing that we put out there is going to change their beliefs. And in fact, in that sort of motivated reasoning, people will sort of turn it. Well, of course, the mainstream media is going to say anything that President Trump says is a lie. Of course, the Post is going to give him 5 Pinocchios on that, and it just sort of reinforces that. So I think in a lot of ways, people who are on the extreme ends are not. There's not much is going to sway them because their belief is part of their identity. That being said, I think with a lot of misinformation, because there is a lot of different things going on, when people call misinformation into question with fact checks, we do know that it reduces the virality of the misinformation in a lot of cases. When someone calls something into question, like on a Twitter post or a Facebook post, when somebody interjects a fact check in there, people are less likely to share it because now there's a question. Because I think a lot of people would have that moment of caution, like, I don't want to share something that I don't think is true.
Yeah.
So we know that there is some effectiveness, maybe in the middle range of the spectrum, but also depending on the type of misinformation we're talking about. So I think we should keep doing it. But I also think, something that Kyle said, I think that we need to have a conversation about the way fact checkers label things, right?
Mhm.
I think the Washington Post uses Pinocchios. I think it's PolitiFact, calls things pants on fire, right? I think that we need to take that sort of loaded language out of the fact checks and simply label them true or not true, to keep that.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I keep getting I'm on a bit of a delay, so that's what's happening.
No, go ahead.
Well, just what you were saying about identity and people's political identity being so strong, I think is really important here. And I also think one of the things that's new in the last 4 years is that news brands have become part of people's identities in ways that they never were before. So, whether you're a Fox News person or an MSNBC person is very central to your belief system, your political belief system now, in a way that it simply was not before. And I think, the politics, the news brand probably follow politics, or in some cases, maybe not. Maybe one fed the other direction. But I just know, and these news companies are trying to capitalize on this to gain subscribers, and they're actually trying to sort of foster this idea that we are a part of your identity. If you're a New York Times person, you believe we can sort of articulate a set of beliefs that you have. But I mean, it just makes people even more entrenched. So I don't know. I think this is I find that part of it really interesting and sort of new on how these media brands are now sort of part of the political outfits that we have.
Yeah, it all sort of becomes kind of shorthand for this is my tribe, and I've found them, and it's an easy way to find them. And I wanted to ask, one of the things when you talked about the ways the emotion plays into this, you didn't talk about a thing that I've often heard, and I'm curious if this is something you found as well, that one of the big reasons people share stuff, even if it isn't verified and even if it is misinformation, is it's a way of building community and going and finding and building their tribe online. And as more of our lives have turned online, even before the pandemic, but certainly now, when we spend all our lives on the computer, that's playing an ever increasing, more important role of, I know if I share this kind of material, I'm gonna, find my people, and it's gonna reinforce that sense of identity.
Yeah, when you look at some of the things just generally about human behavior, if you ever study the field of rumor theory, about why people share rumors. I mean, if you think about it, it goes back to our earliest ancestral days sharing stories around the fire. But today, it's also part of what we call shared sense making. This idea that when things are confusing, when there's a lot of anxiety and fear, and we're trying to understand any piece of information that we get, we have this compulsion to try to share with others so that we can build an understanding. Social media actually amplifies that in really important ways, because social media has conditioned us to share and overshare things just in general. So you take that sort of natural human behavior of rumor sharing, and sharing information, you add this now almost compulsion in many cases to just share everything on social media for our followers because we want the likes and the comments. So social media really taps into that sort of psychological need. And you're right. So misinformation, even if it's something that we don't think it might not be true, we're going to throw it into the mix to sort of see how it fits because we think it might be important.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about, so what do you see? We've talked a bit about, the role of journalism in this. What is kind of the role or the responsibility for consumers, for news consumers, to sort of, they want to make sure that, to the extent possible, they're not spreading misinformation and are part of the problem. What's their role?
Well, I think we all have to acknowledge that the social media platforms are not going to fix this problem.
Yeah.
I mean, they're taking some steps to try to mitigate some things. You know, Facebook has done a couple. You know, they've been banning a lot of groups on Facebook. You know, these closed groups. You know, things like QAnon, conspiracy theories. They've been banning Holocaust denial groups and the like. But the reality is that, you know, social media is actually becoming more important for us right now because we are physically isolated from each other. That social media is actually, we're trying to use it for its original intention of, you know, of maintaining the social connections through technology. But I think it's on us to recognize that we can use social media responsibly for its intended purpose, which is to maintain those social connections. But if we want to be informed, we can't get our news from Facebook or Twitter. We have to go to a reputable source. And as Kyle mentioned, you know, I think one of the most important things we can do is support local journalism.
Yeah. Okay. I want to come back to one other thing a little broadly, and then I'm going to open it up because I see there's quite a number of questions. And that's back to the issue, Kyle, you talked about of, you know, how difficult it has been for a lot of mainstream journalists to, you know, to out and out say something's untrue. There was a huge debate in journalism about whether you could actually say the president was lying, even if he's repeated the same untruth 150 times in a speech. And, you know, you've talked about the need for, you know, new structures or formats and whatnot. I wondered, can you elaborate a little bit on that? I know there's, you know, some discussion of what Jay Rosen, who's a press critic at NYU, talks about a truth sandwich where you contextualize very quickly you state the truth first, then the misstatement, and then you repeat it. So it's a sandwich of the misstatement or the mistruth. But can you talk a little bit, I don't know whether that's something you're talking about. What do you think of that as a strategy, or are there other formats or techniques that either of you think journalism should be moving towards or using in order to avoid some of these problems?
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how you frame stories, and not leading with the falsehood, essentially. And also just, you know, this also gets to this question of sort of both sides-ism. And, you know, if somebody, and at CGR, we've been doing a lot of work on trying to improve the media's coverage of the climate crisis, for instance. And that's been a big problem for quite a long time, is even though science overwhelmingly has decided that climate change is here and is caused by human factors, and the vast majority of science supports that view, until very, very recently, I'm talking about like a year ago, it was still very common for you to say, well, this is happening and it's caused by climate. Of course, not everybody agrees, and here's like one random weird outlier person who's going to say that it's not real. And in fact, that's not balanced, because if 97 scientists think one thing and 3 think another, you don't have to present them equally. So I think the same thing happens here on political misinformation. And I mentioned that there is this, like, and again, we saw this as we worked with news organizations and on their climate coverage. Like, they're just scared to death of being seen as political. And they're scared to death of saying, like, if we go out there and say this is true or this isn't true, we're sort of, we're stepping over a line that our audience is going to be uncomfortable with. And our response is that, well, you're misserving your audience if you don't approach it this way. So I think it just takes a mind shift. But yeah, I think this true sandwich thing is one good idea. I think there's just other ways to think about, like, just being free to, you know, this sort of like old inverted pyramid of story writing, where you just write, you know, you leave all the analysis out, or you leave the analysis to later, is not a good approach in the climate that we're in. I think you have to take, I think even straight news needs to be be free to be a lot more analytical than a lot of journalists, traditional journalists, are comfortable with. Can I just say one more thing about the other question that we were talking about how what consumers should do about this? And I thought John had some great practical ideas, but and I think it all comes down to I do think people need to take responsibility for understanding what they're reading and where it's coming from. I mean, I like, this notion of kind of a media diet, and like, we don't walk down the street and see something on the street and pop it into our mouth. I mean, we actually put some thought into, like, I wonder what that is, I wonder where it came from, and wonder how long it's been sitting there. So we at CJR did an experiment. Now, it's been a couple of years ago. I think it's pretty apt. We were trying to make a point about why, just because it's, that if people have tended to trust what they see in print more than what's on, or trust what's on the internet, and they view the trust within print differently. So what we did was we took a newsstand in Times Square in New York City. We took out all of the publications, and we replaced them with publications that looked like the real thing, but that were actually, the headlines were totally fake stories taken off the internet, and we mocked them up to look like Time Magazine or The Economist or the New York Post or whatever. And these are like way over the top stories. Like, one was about Hollywood elites having toddler fight clubs where they would put little kids in a room and have them fight. Or one was about people drinking blood. One was about Trump taking over Canada, I think. Anyways, like crazy stuff. And we just we put in cameras. This is all online if you want to take a look. It was quite elaborate. And we sort of watched how people interacted with these. And then after, we went up to them and said, hey, what'd you think about that thing? Did you think it was real? And I mean, the findings were interesting. I mean, on the one hand, people were like, well, it seemed real enough to me, even though it was ridiculous. But then once they sort of absorbed what it was, they were like, well, that's obviously fake. And there was just something about seeing it in print that they were a little more careful than if they had, and it just sort of whizzed past their Facebook.
Yeah.
So what we were trying, and inside we had an insert about how to recognize misinformation. But the point of it was that, like, just because it's on your Facebook feed doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's on Twitter doesn't mean it's true. And people need to, and I thought what John said about the lateral search,
that was
like,
great.
people just need to they need to take some responsibility.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a few comments that irritate me more than people saying, oh, the media never covers that. Well, how do you know about it? And like, there was lots of coverage, but maybe you weren't reading the publication that covered it,
Yeah.
Drives me nuts. John, did you have anything else you wanted to add for the, the question I asked about kind of, are there formats or structures or things you think would help improve some of this? And
I think those are, I think, some of the key things for people to process tonight, to think about some things that they can start doing. Yeah. I'll just plug that we have a number of other resources at the News Literacy Project that are available for people. You can go to our website at newslit.org, NEWSLIT.org. We have a lot of suggestions and tips and resources that if you want to explore this further. But I think this is probably a good starting point for a lot of people to consider some first steps to being a more informed consumer of news.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, let me take a look at some of the questions here. There are two quite similar questions, basically, looking at the foreign nature of some of the misinformation. One is how to stop the misinformation campaigns spread by foreign entities through cyber attacks. And then following that, how much misinformation has a foreign source for a political or economic purpose?
I think to the first point, I don't know that we can stop it, because it's very easy for people to create fake profiles and fake, to create these like Facebook groups and the like, to churn out content. I don't know that trying to stop it at its source is anything that there's any practical solution to. The thing is, though, that we also have to remember is that while a lot of misinformation does originate from foreign sources, the reason it goes viral is because people share it. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, when people did some studies about misinformation during the 2016 election, upwards of 70% of the political misinformation that we saw wasn't from the creators, it was from people who were sharing it. So this comes back to that idea of personal responsibility and being more selective in how we get our information and being cautious about what and when we share things and making sure we're only sharing things that we verified to be true.
Okay. Another question, in this hyper-partisan world, how do we civically engage with others who may have bought into misinformation that suits their confirmation bias? In other words, how do you engage with somebody who you think has gone down the rabbit hole?
I get asked this a lot.
Yeah.
So the first step is do not approach with confrontation, approach with empathy. You have to acknowledge that this is something that someone believes to be true. It could be something that they hold very dear to them. And you want to engage in a conversation with them in a way that invites them to scrutinize new information. You don't want to, you don't want to say, I can't believe you believe that. You want to start with, yeah, okay, I get what you're saying. I see what you believe. Have you seen this, right? Have you read this? Can I ask you to look at this, right? And it's this idea that we want them to look at some new information and hopefully process it for themselves. But that all being said, you also have to be prepared to walk away, right? Because I think one of the biggest challenges we have right now is that we no longer engage in discourse. Everything is a debate. Right. And when we have debates, it implies that there's a winner and there's a loser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We need to try to get back to a position of discourse where we're sharing our ideas openly and freely and respectfully, and being open to the idea that we might take in new information and change our views on some things.
Yeah. Should social media have some stronger rules for political speech? I mean, we had a hearing today where clearly, it doesn't look like a whole lot's going to come out of that, but, and certainly, as I think one of you mentioned earlier, the social media companies do not look like they're stepping up to take a stronger role. What's your sense? Should they? How would that happen?
Yeah, I don't think we're talking here about political speech. I mean, I don't think there's much debate about whether that should be allowed. It's just political misinformation, I think, is where we get in the fuzzy zone. I don't know. I think John's probably got a better idea on that.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I keep going back to when I think about this type of question is like the way Mark Zuckerberg first was talking about Holocaust denial, right? He was actually defending allowing Holocaust denial on Facebook because it was something that people believed in. But now they've changed their position and they're starting to ban it. I think that the platforms do need to step up and take more responsibility for the things that we know are completely false. Like the Holocaust happened, right? Vaccines are safe. Humans have been to the moon. The earth is round, right? Like there are things that we know, but Facebook in particular has these breeding grounds of conspiratorial thinking and some of these conspiracy theories that have actually led to some very dangerous confrontations. That's where I think the social media companies need to take responsibility about sort of the content of their platforms, because that's where the most danger is.
Do you think Congress should actually hold them responsible for removing that kind of content?
No, I don't actually, because I think if we start talking about regulating content on a platform like that, we get into some very dangerous First Amendment territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it has to be us, the users, holding the platforms accountable, right? If we are the users, we are the source of their revenue through the advertising that shows up on our feeds in a large part, and they exist because we have profiles on their sites. So it's also it can be upon us to try to organize to force them to take clear action. But I would be very cautious about trying to legislate that.
Are there other legal remedies against misinformation? Someone asks, to what extent do they exist?
Yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, if you think about it, there are libel and slander laws that are out there. The challenge, though, is that who do you go after with that, right? If you can prove that someone created a false rumor about you, and you can prove that they were the originator of it, you could have some legal recourse. But the reality is that there's, unless you can prove personal harm, so for example, like, there have been people who've been trying to figure out if they could sue certain anti-vaccine proponents because, they didn't vaccinate their child and their child got sick.
Yeah.
But is that really the responsibility of the anti-vaxxer, or is that the responsibility of the parent who chose not to vaccinate their child?
Yeah. Yeah.
I also think news companies need to take some responsibility for basically outsourcing their audience to these platforms, and just turning over the relationship, the online relationship, to Facebook, instead of trying to sort of develop appeal to their users. So that's sort of on them, and that's a failing on their part, I think. And also, this has sort of happened anyway because Facebook has downgraded news in the algorithm. So a lot of the audience that had been, when you have serious news on a Facebook feed, it's not, it oftentimes isn't the greatest neighborhood. And it doesn't often sort of always reflect well on your brand. But again, this is something that I think news companies should have recognized some time ago, and they hope to just keep writing that audience. But in the end, they outsourced that relationship, which sort of turned against them.
Yeah. Okay. One of the questioners asked, can you suggest some names of some of the other fact-checking organizations? They were only familiar with Snopes and wondered if there are a couple of others that either of you could recommend that you think were good.
I generally don't recommend any one particular fact-check organization. There is PolitiFact. AFP has really good fact-checking. Major news organizations have fact-checking sort of groups. I think that if you just sort of do a search for fact-checking organizations, you'll see a lot of different ones out there. But I just want to reiterate that when you go looking for that, you want to evaluate them carefully to make sure that these are reputable organizations that are trying to do legitimate fact checks, that are transparent in their methods and how they do it, and that they show their work. Right? They don't just make a determination; they're actually providing evidence and context and background. But yeah, so Snopes is one of the most popular. There's PolitiFact, FactCheck.org. What's that? NewsGuard. Right, NewsGuard. There's a few others.
Yeah.
But they're all sort of a drop in the bucket, right, John? I mean, just the capacity of them to sort of stay on top of everything is minuscule.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, I know some people who are involved in fact checking. I've done some work with Jane Litvinenko at BuzzFeed News. They cover a lot of misinformation. Jane's a wonderful reporter. I've done some work with her in the past, and I remember the last time I saw her when I was up in Canada doing some work with them. She's fairly young. She's in, I believe, her early 30s, and at the time she said she was on her second ulcer. And like it's like the people are doing this work, it's eating them up sometimes, and it's one of those things that they're doing this work. It's incredibly difficult, but they're still doing it.
Yeah, and coming up with fabulous stuff. This is an interesting question. Whoops, it moved a little bit. Will there be another Walter Cronkite ever, or a sort of long-form interview and debate program like William F. Buckley's Firing Line to help inform the public? You see something like that emerging out of this as a lot of people are searching for higher quality information?
It's interesting that question came out because I don't know if everybody else did, but I watched the 60 Minutes interviews with Trump and Biden, and to be honest, I've sort of lapsed on 60 Minutes. I haven't watched it in several years, but I was sort of struck by the pace of it and how it was slow, and it kind of let people talk in sound bites that were quite long. And it was notable to me. I think you see it in print now. If you look at most of the most popular stories on most of the big websites, they tend to be the longer and more in-depth pieces. So I mean, it's a complete falsehood to say that people don't read long stories. I mean, I know that in our own shop, we do a lot of web stories every day, and then we have a quarterly magazine where we do long form pieces that are 4, 5, 6,000 words. Inevitably, those are the most read stories on our website, and I know that's the case at most other places as well. So there is an appetite, there is an enormous appetite for this. I mean, what we're up against now is the economics of journalism are brutal.
Yeah.
And that kind of work costs a lot of money. And so the economic forces are going to be pushing against it. But I think the audience need is there going the other direction.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Couple of last questions. Is there some historical research on our news and information outlets that shows periods where misinformation thrives and what might create or cause optimal environments for it?
Well, I'll tell you, as a former history teacher, misinformation is nothing new when it comes to especially politics. I mean, you can go all the way back to the story of Nero in ancient Rome, right? Misinformation and conspiracy theories have always been part of any time of political upheaval when there's big social movements. This year, 2020 in particular has almost created the perfect storm of things that are causing us to seek out information and latch on to things that may not be true, because there are so many things that are causing anxiety and fear and discomfort. And in that discomfort, we can be more easily manipulated. But I think that when you look at when you go back through presidential elections throughout American history, misinformation, propaganda, outlandish claims have always been part of our political process.
We haven't invented anything new. We've just made them far more viral, I guess.
Yeah, we just have new ways of communicating it.
Yeah, yeah. One last question we got. Do you feel that we need to train teens to become their own fact checkers?
Absolutely. Actually, we need to start younger.
Really? At what age would you start? What age do you think people?
If we're talking about just generally news literacy, the research suggests 3rd grade. I've actually spoken to some child development specialists, but also, so my son, he's currently in 5th grade. And when he was in 3rd grade, I remember he brought home an article from this junior scholastic magazine they were using that was talking about fake news when he was in 3rd grade. So 3rd grade is about a good developmental age where you can start teaching the basics, like the difference between news and opinion.
Why is I'm surprised that it's that young. What is it that makes that a good age that you can really begin to use?
Well, it's just, it goes back to brain development. It's, by the time you're getting to be about 8 to 10 years old is when you're starting to develop, the functions for some basic, critical thinking. When you're able to ask critical questions and seek out and start to learn how to seek out answers. So starting with some of the basics, the younger, the better. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's the end of the questions in the chat. So I think that's, this has been a really interesting and fabulous discussion. I think you guys have hit on some really, really super useful points. So thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And I see Rhoda's back with us.
Yes, I am. And I want to thank you too. We knew it was going to be a challenging topic, and we certainly began a great discussion with some provocative thoughts. And we all have responsibility in this challenging issue. And we look forward to having further discussions on this. So thank you all. It's been a wonderful evening, and we've learned a lot. I know that.
Thank you,
And
Rhoda.
again, if you have questions that
Jane.
you come up with after the program is ended, feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to get you some answers. So thanks again. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you, Jane, for a great job tonight.
Great. Thank you all. It was really interesting, fascinating stuff. And thank you all for your questions too from the audience.
Yeah, they
It's
were
always
great
helpful.
questions. Okay, good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.